up our home goods and clothing items are made in China, it is a good idea to step back and understand how those goods actually get to us. In 2012, an Oregon mother came face to face with the reality of cheap American consumerism when an SOS letter from China fell out of a box of $5 Halloween decorations. The writer was an engineer imprisoned in a Chinese labor camp where he was forced to work for more than 15 hours a day as part of his re-education by the Chinese government. 2 weeks ago, the US announced sanctions against these certain Chinese officials for serious human rights abuses, but is this enough? Good evening and welcome to the program. Thank you for joining us. I'm Kirsten Cullenberg, Programs Manager at the World Affairs Council of Dallas-Fort Worth. Our program this evening features award-winning investigative journalist Amelia Pang on her new book, Made in China, A Prisoner, an SOS Letter, and the Hidden Cost of America's Cheap Goods. She is joined in conversation by Council President and CEO, Liz Brailsford. You can purchase a copy of Made in China at Interrobang Books, our local bookstore partner. Our audience receives a 10% discount from Interrobang Books' online store by using the code dfwworld at checkout. And remember, that discount code is good for any of the books in your online shopping cart, not just Made in China. The Council has a full schedule of upcoming virtual programs, so remember to check out our website at dfwworld.org for newly scheduled events. The Council is incredibly grateful for all of its supporters, and tonight I'd like to especially thank Macy Hyken for her program sponsorship. Macy serves on the Council's Board of Directors, and we thank her for her continued support of our mission and of the Focus on China series. I'd like to remind everyone that you too can sponsor a program at the Council for as little as $500 or $1,000, and to get in touch with Alana Buenrosto at 956-466-1149 about sponsorship opportunities. And now I have the pleasure of introducing tonight's speaker, Amelia Pang. Amelia is an award-winning investigative journalist, as I mentioned previously. She is currently editor at EdTech Magazine. Her work has been featured in the New Republic, the New York Times Sunday Review, and other publications. As I mentioned before, Amelia joins us today to discuss her book, Made in China. This excellent read sheds new light on China's corrupt system of forced labor and its connection to an almost insatiable global demand for cheap goods. Now, the planned moderator for tonight's program, Amanda Schnetzer, sends her regards, but is unfortunately unable to make it tonight. Liz Brailsford, Council President and CEO, will be filling in for her. Prior to joining our council just a couple of months ago, Liz was the Chief Operating Officer of the World Affairs Councils of America, known as WACA in Washington, D.C., which serves more than 90 affiliated councils across the United States. We are absolutely thrilled to have her here in Dallas and moderating her first program. Liz, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Kirsten. And first, let me say, I'd just like to welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us. And thank you to my team for their agility and flexibility with this. We found out just about an hour ago that we could not have our wonderful moderator, Amanda. So please bear with us through this. I will be honest that I have not had a chance to read this book yet, although I am very excited to do so. So you are stuck with me tonight. And we're excited for this. Amelia, I was thrilled to see this book come to us, and you agreed to be with us because this is a topic that touches everyone here in the US, whether they're willing to acknowledge it, whether they ignore it, whether they do something about it. We're going to dig into this. There's a lot to talk about with this topic, so let's get right to it. And what I'd like to do is really start with you. Why did you write this book, and why this topic? Why now? Just tell us a little bit about yourself.
Thank you so much for the introduction. Such an honor to be here. Although the book centers on an SOS letter that was discovered in 2012, this was really not, this is a very old issue. The first SOS letter of this kind was actually discovered in the US in the 90s, and it was written by a political prisoner who had organized pro-democracy protests in southern China. And this, unfortunately, is not the last SOS letter of this kind to be found in an American or Western product. And many forced laborers, actually a growing number of forced laborers, continue to be detained in China. Many of them are political dissidents, religious dissidents, ethnic minorities, and various petty criminals who didn't actually commit any kind of real or violent crime. These are the people that end up stuck in these extra legal detention centers, a lot of times making our cheap goods.
Well, it certainly has been in the news a lot in recent years. So for background, help us understand a little bit, what exactly is a Chinese labor camp and what purpose do they serve? Who runs them? How pervasive are they?
These are very pervasive facilities. Some of them are actual prisons where the detainees have been sentenced in a court, although China has a 99.9% prosecution rate, so that doesn't really say a whole lot if they've received an actual sentence. But what is more troubling is that many of these detention centers are extra legal, so the detainees there have not gone to trial, they do not have access to a lawyer, and they are really held there indefinitely. A lot of times doing very grueling manufacturing work for 15 to 20 hours a day.
And it sounds like from the proof of these, the evidence of these letters that we're receiving in the US, since you said since the 90s, at least that we know about, it sounds like they may not be able to connect with their families or any type of law, legal aid or anything like that. And so that's why they are reaching out to us through these letters and other means similar to that.
Yes, exactly. It's very hard for them to get any kind of legal help once you get stuck in one of these labor camps. The person in my book that I focus on, he actually was able to find a human rights lawyer who would take this on. Unfortunately, the result was that this lawyer ended up in prison himself, and not just for standing up for this particular political prisoner, but his various human rights works in China. And he continues to be under house arrest today. So the risks that lawyers face in China, the personal risks, the risks for their families is quite high, and there's not many lawyers willing to stand up for the millions of people who are arbitrarily detained in these camps.
And the types of examples that you hear about in the news of others who are detained for other types of freedoms that they're fighting for just seems to be pervasive across the country. So it's interesting. You said that this note was found in 2012, which we're going to talk about in a few minutes, but it was that human rights attorney, has he been on house arrest since that time?
He was imprisoned and released a few years ago, but since his release, he has remained under house arrest, and his daughter and wife have escaped to the US. I believe they're in California. His name is Jiang Tongyong, but I don't believe he's been released from house arrest in China.
Yep. Okay. So our re-education through labor camps a recent phenomenon? It sounds like there was a note that was found in the 90s that you mentioned. Or does it have a history beyond that? Does it have other examples in other countries?
Oh, yes, absolutely. You know, forced labor, especially corvée labor, it's really not a new phenomenon. It existed in many parts of the world. It existed in ancient China. You know, the Great Wall, all of that was built on the backs of corvée labor. But it was really with the rise of the Chinese Communist Party in 1949, and actually even earlier than that, as the party was beginning to gain momentum and take control parts of China, you started to see these early camps, really, where the detainees were held for a political purpose. They were political enemies and they were used for their labor. And these earliest political labor camps in China were actually based off of Soviet gulags. So the conditions are quite horrific. Torture is prevalent. Sexual violence, unfortunately, is very prevalent in the women's camps. And unfortunately, since the 1930s, they have expanded at a rapid rate.
Well, you mentioned women, so I guess the first part of my next question is, how many people are in labor camps today? Do we have really an accurate estimate of that? And then what are their crimes that they're being put into these camps for? And as you mentioned, women, let's talk a little bit more about that, because I think it's an incredibly important point to understand. What are the experiences of women in these camps, if you can talk more about that, and are they also, to what extent are they targets for forced labor?
That's a great question. You know, it's hard to say an exact figure of how many people are actually detained in these camps because the Chinese government doesn't release this data. But what we do know is that in the Uyghur camps alone, the Uyghurs are ethnic minority that are, a lot of them are being detained in China in the Xinjiang region. Just in the Uyghur camps alone, anywhere between 1.5 to 3 million people are detained. And that's just one demographic. There's many different types of camps holding other demographics throughout China. So it's the numbers in the millions, we could safely say that. As for what the women specifically face, if you talk to any female forced labor survivor in China, they can attest to the sexual violence, again, that the guards, they face from the guards, really brutal violence. Gang rape is pretty common. Getting shocked by electric batons as they're experiencing their sexual violence is common. It's very, I don't want to get too graphic here and disturb the audience, but we are learning that with the rise of the Uyghur camps, the sexual violence seems to be even worse because you're seeing the women actually getting sold to men outside of the camps who will come and have their way with them. And so it's a huge issue. I think there really needs to be more consumers. It needs to be part of our larger social consciousness to be aware that the people that actually make these products, what they're actually facing in these camps.
Well, your book does exactly that, shedding light on the topic and helping people become aware, even more than they were, become aware of this horrific practice. You mentioned millions of people in camps, and even with the large population that China has, around 1.4 billion, I think it is approximately these days. That's still an astonishing amount for any country of any size. So I want to transition a little bit to really the central part or the beginning point of your book, and that's Sun Yi. And you introduced us to him earlier in the book, and he spent years in the Masanjia labor camp. Who was Sun Yi, and why is his story significant?
Yes, Sun Yi was a religious dissident. I wanted to focus on his story because he was actually manufacturing decorative gravestones at Masanjia labor camp, Masanjia reeducation through labor camp. And it's a camp where there were actual graves that the detainees were buried in if they passed away after being tortured or malnourished under these very terrible conditions. And so essentially you have American Halloween decorations being manufactured at an actual grave site. And I just thought that was a powerful way to show the connection between the horrors on that side of the world, and to make that direct connection to us as consumers.
Yeah, I mean, the connection, but the incongruency of the purposes of those graves, and what a way to illuminate the topic. So he was a follower of the spiritual movement called Falun Gong. And why has this movement, Falun Gong, been a target? And what makes them threatening to the Communist Party or problematic?
The Falun Gong group does have a unique ability to organize large protests and other types of underground dissident activities and networks in China that is very difficult and dangerous to organize, and not a whole lot of groups are willing to do it. So the fact that this group got as popular as it did in the 90s, and I believe around 70 million had joined, and by the time that it was banned in the 90s, that was a major threat to an authoritarian regime that up until that moment had been able to control protests, pretty effectively. I mean, after the Tiananmen Square protests, you really didn't really see any other groups on mainland China doing that kind of organizing. You're seeing that in Hong Kong right now, though they don't consider themselves part of mainland China. They have a very different culture and mentality there. But it is very rare to see groups in mainland China actually take on that kind of bold, organized resistance. And that is what Falun Gong does in China. And that's the main reason why anyone who decides to join this initiative ends up in essentially labor camps.
Yeah, I know it's widely known that China has such a restrictive clamp down on protests and anything of that sort. I mean, I think still to this day that they won't address or mention the details and what happened at Tiananmen Square that year. So I could see in their eyes why this would be such a problem. So you mentioned that that this message was found in Halloween decorations. A woman named Julia finds them at her house when she gets the package. She lives in Portland, Oregon. And really, how ubiquitous in the United States are Chinese goods made by forced labor? I mean, as we said in the beginning of the program, it's incredibly difficult to find so many of the goods that we have in our country that are not made by China. So how common are they made in the labor camps, and how do we know that?
It is very common. I mean, right now we're seeing evidence that everything from the raw materials to solar panels to the human hair extensions that's gotten popular these days, a lot of that is made in forced labor facilities. It's so ubiquitous that it is really difficult to tell which product or which company isn't using forced labor. During my research for this book, I learned that the way that most corporations audit their Chinese suppliers is extremely flawed. It's virtually impossible for them to detect secret or hidden subcontracting to a forced labor facility. And it's essentially by design. Most of these audits are designed more to protect the corporation in light of a scandal than to actually protect the workers and actually look into workers' rights in any kind of fundamental way. So there's a chapter in my book about that, about the flaws in our auditing systems and simple things that can be improved to reduce the number of forced labor goods that are coming into the US.
There's a question that comes from Ray Termini, one of our really wonderful members. He asks, is there a relationship between legitimate manufacturing in China and these forced labor camps?
There are a lot of times, I wouldn't say all legitimate manufacturers have a relationship with labor camps. There's definitely good ones out there, but a lot of times they do have a relationship, and it's very hard for a company to tell based on the current ways that they're inspecting their factories. When I went to China to do research for my book in early 2019, I visited the camps. I followed the trucks that left these camps. and I follow them to the official suppliers, the legitimate suppliers, so-called, that our companies are sourcing from. They went to all kinds of exporters, from everything from a pet products manufacturer to a bike brakes manufacturer, to a pharmaceutical, to even an official Apple supplier. The actual address, when I Googled it, showed up as an official Apple supplier list. So, there's definitely a connection between these camps and exporters that work with our companies.
So truly, these are products that are touching all of our lives in one way or another. You mentioned bicycle supplies just now, Apple supplies. You mentioned hair extensions a few minutes ago, and a couple of other things. There's a question from Robert Potter that you've addressed mainly with what's being made in the camps, but are there other supplies that you can think of that we're using that they're making in those camps?
It's hard to say what isn't made in these camps. Usually the more high-tech things, they'll have more specialized factories that have been specifically tooled for that product and need certain kind of skilled workers to make it. Usually that won't actually be manufactured in a camp, but they could have the final packaging or something like that done at a camp. So you could still see a connection between those facilities. But a lot of times the things that are made in the actual camp are, garments. Fast fashion is a big culprit. Little parts that require tedious assembling that you can kind of just drop off at a camp and have them do it and pick it back up a few hours later. It's really hard to say. I think basically every industry is touched by forced labor at this point. It's hard. I don't think I could say that there's even a specific product that isn't manufactured or hasn't touched a labor camp at any point of the supply chain.
You mentioned fast fashion. I've been reading more and more about that in recent years, but it's a huge problem because fast fashion is something that is so appealing to so many of us Americans because it is cheap clothing that you can buy that may not last. In fact, it probably won't last. It's going to tear apart or get worn in or lose a button or many buttons. And that's really the intent of it. And so it's not going to last you long. It's going to be in style for a very set restrictive time period. And then you move on to the next cheap good. And so I think it's important for people to know that that's where these clothing pieces are coming from. So I'm really glad that you mentioned that.
Yes, and the reason why fast fashion is such a big problem is because, well, when I was doing research for my book, I found out that a lot of times the factory owners at legitimate factories, they cannot realistically make the product for that short of a deadline that our companies are giving them. For example, I don't have evidence that Fashion Nova specifically is using forced labor, but I find it troubling how fast that they can produce products. So you have fast fashion, and then now you have ultra fast fashion. The fact that they're only online, they are able to reduce the time between design, production, distribution, even more than before. The CEO of Fashion Nova has famously bragged to the New York Times that they can turn something from a design into an actual clothing in less than 24 hours. Less than 24 hours. I mean, what happened to make that possible? When factories don't have enough time to make a product, they have to outsource work to some pretty shady places, like very unethical factories or prison camps where detainees can stay up 20 hours a day to manufacture the goods to help meet our production deadlines. Because if the official supplier doesn't meet our deadline, then they'll be charged a huge fine by the company a lot of the times. So large of a fine that they won't actually even make a profit for manufacturing that good. They'll probably have to maintain a good relationship with Our companies might have to fly that product overseas instead of shipping it to get it there faster. And flying is extremely expensive for the factory. So there's a lot of factors that go into play in terms of why that factory owner ultimately makes that decision to outsource work to a forced labor facility. And a lot of times, though, that decision is made based on factors that have everything to do with us.
Yep. One last statement about that is that I can imagine that some companies, if they missed these deadlines, would just stop working with those forced labor camps, perhaps. And then, there's even less money to go around on that side. I'll also say that I read an article some years ago, 3 or 4 years ago, about major name brands tossing unused, unpurchased bags of clothing in dumpsters because it hadn't been sold, and it was on to the next cycle of fast fashion. So it really is an interesting, problem that we have. But I want to move on to a powerful statement that you had in your book about Sun Yi. And it says, he was a caged animal, but in his mind, he was free. Can you say more about that?
He was very much like a caged animal in that camp. He was there for 2.5 years, but it felt like decades to him because every day they did the same repetitive tasks. They didn't have access to see their family or friends. Most of them, if they're political detainees like Sunni, he sometimes even forgot that he was alive in a sense, because there were just people dying all around him, and he just hadn't been a part of the outside world in so long. But he, against all odds, he held on to his spirituality, and I think that was what made him feel like he was still free in his mind, and that was what got him through all the torture and really debilitating experiences there.
Well, let's broaden this topic a little bit. And I see through, we have a lot of questions, by the way, but I see through the questions that people are interested in other groups within China, and particularly the Uyghurs. And that's something that I wanted to talk about as well, so that dovetails. But in any case, let's talk about the Uyghurs. They're a Muslim minority living within China's Xinjiang province. We know from firsthand stories, satellite imagery, and other sources that millions, and as you mentioned a little while ago, that millions of people have been detained in China in forced labor camps. So why the Uyghurs? And from Paul Pass, he is the executive director of the Japan-America Society of DFW here. He asked, like I said, why the Uyghurs and why are they disproportionately, and in comparison to other minorities such as Manchu or Miao?
That's a great question. I can tell a personal story. I'm actually part Uyghur and part Chinese, or part Han Chinese. My grandmother was half Uyghur. She was born and raised in Xinjiang, or what the Uyghurs like to call East Turkestan. Because Xinjiang is what the Chinese government calls their new frontier. That's what it translates as. And the why they're targeted. Well, really for decades, there's been a concerted effort to force the Uyghurs to assimilate and identify as Han Chinese, to kind of create this unified single state race in China, and have that be Han dominated. And the reason for that is the Chinese government doesn't want any kind of potential problems for the economic investments they've made in the Xinjiang region. it was previously the trade route for the Silk Road. That region in northwestern China is of huge trade and strategic importance to China. It connects China to the Middle East, it connects China to Europe, it connects China to West Asia. A lot of important trade routes go through there today. It's a key part of the Belt and Road Initiative, which, for those of you who are not familiar, that's China's $1 trillion economic development strategy. And it's almost too big to fail. So they're extremely worried that past treatments of Uyghurs might have created some discontent in that region. They're afraid of any kind of protests or movement for independence, things like that, that might destabilize the economic investments they've made in that region. So that's why this kind of large-scale ban, a large-scale imprisonment of Uyghurs began. You can see that the years where it began, 2016, 2018, it really aligned with major investments that China made in that region for the Belt and Road Initiative. China says it's because they're afraid of terrorism. This is a counterterrorism initiative because the Uyghurs are mostly Muslims. But even the US government's counterterrorism experts say this is not a very good counterterrorism strategy because you're targeting every single person in Xinjiang. The scope is simply too broad. You need to have a more targeted approach if it's actual counterterrorism policy. So, it really doesn't hold up because the Chinese government will say opposing things. They'll sometimes say this is counterterrorism. They'll also sometimes say that this is a vocational training initiative. These are not camps, they're just vocational training centers to help backwards Turkic people learn skills that can get them manufacturing work. But what you're seeing with a lot of the people detained in these factories are professors, they're even celebrities, they're really like a lot of leaders in the community. It's a very targeted approach to capture people who have influence, people who are quite prominent and do not need manufacturing training.
We are speaking with Amelia Pang on her new book, Made in China, A Prisoner, an SOS Letter, and the Hidden Cost of America's Cheap Goods. Like we mentioned in the beginning, if you have a question, please do put it in the Q&A box. And Amelia, we are having several questions come through here. I wanted to ask from Lange Navarro, how do you get these photos? So if we're monitoring the situation in China and we know that these labor camps are going on, how are we getting these pictures and videos of the camps if the internet is so restricted? Obviously the satellite is one thing, but I know on the ground, photos and videos are another. So how is that happening?
There has been a small number of journalists who have managed to go to Xinjiang and get some kind of recording done. Vice actually did a terrific documentary on this. They had one of their reporters post the tourists and secretly film in the camps. I encourage everyone to watch it. It's very chilling. They were able to capture footage of people being sent to the camps in real time. As for, it is getting harder and harder to document though, with China's crackdown on foreign journalists. You're seeing a lot of journalists with major institutions like the BBC getting kicked out for reporting on what's happening to the Uyghurs and forced labor facilities. So no, it is very troubling, but like you said, the satellite images can still reveal a lot. We're still able to get quite a lot of documentation about the growth of the camps. Another reason why we're able to get this documentation is because the Chinese government tries to actually openly promote these camps as vocational training centers. They're also called the Uyghur Labor Transfer Program, where they're moving Uyghurs outside of Xinjiang into various forced labor factories throughout China and through other parts of Xinjiang as well. And you can look up Uyghur Labor Transfer Program in Chinese and see a lot of footage by Chinese domestic media promoting this particular policy, and you can see which factories are participating, and then you can track from there which companies those factories are associated with.
Mm. So on the note of monitoring and things like that in China, we're getting some questions about how did you go undetected if you were in areas that you may not were supposed to be in, and how was your experience there? Did you feel like you were in danger when you were in China?
I was worried, but I actually went undetected and didn't get arrested at any point. So I actually got a lot done. Um, there's been a lot of coverage of Xinjiang and the Uyghur camps, and that's why, and it's good, but also that's why the camps in those regions are very, very tightly monitored. It's very hard for journalists to actually visit there. I was not able to go to Xinjiang myself for that reason. But the camps outside of Xinjiang, there's so many camps outside of Xinjiang with different names. They're not called vocational training centers, but they're called pretrial detention centers or drug detox centers or legal education centers. There's so many innocuous names, but these facilities are all extra legal detention centers where forced labor occurs at a pretty large scale. And in these facilities that don't necessarily detain Uyghur majority populations, they're not as closely guarded, and so you actually are able to visit those on site without drawing much attention if you're not on a journalism visa, which is what I did. I went on a tourism visa so I wouldn't get tracked. Because if you go on a journalism visa, the moment you arrive in Beijing or wherever, the police are gonna have a talk with you to let you know that they're watching you, and you're gonna start getting followed from that moment. But I didn't have that issue because I went as a tourist and tried to stick to camps that were near tourist sites, so it didn't look so odd that I was there. So I went to bigger cities like Shanghai and southern China and Beijing, and I was actually surprised at how easy it was to talk to the guards at the camps and to actually go there and follow the trucks and confirm these details. Because I think the guards there are very used to working with other manufacturers and even corporations themselves. They're used to kind of talking to people and selling the goods that they have made, that are made inside. It's not something they're uncomfortable or they're hiding, which is the chilling part. If you go there and just say that, which I just went there and I said that I was from a company that wanted to, a foreign company that wanted to source products from them, and they were like, yeah, absolutely. They tell you what they make inside. They offer to give you a tour. They really reveal quite a lot of details. And even though a lot of these facilities are called drug detox centers or pre-trial detention centers or vocational training centers or whatever, a lot of times the guards themselves will describe the place as a prison when you talk to them about this facility and what's made inside. And so it was very telling to get these details, and I was actually surprised at how easy it was to just hang out at the camps and follow the trucks that left to see which manufacturers they worked with, which leads me to conclude that if I as an individual journalist can do this, then multi-million-dollar corporations can definitely have the resources to find out more than what I was able to if they wanted to look, or if their audits were designed to look for things like this.
Yeah, very telling indeed. We had a question, how do these, this is from Briarwood Crime Watch, how do these camps compare to the re-education camps that existed in the 1960s and 70s?
Yes, they're very similar. They have different names. The names have evolved over the years. For a while, the re-education through labor camps were one of the main detention centers throughout China. An extra-legal detention center that where detainees, a lot of activists were sent. Since there was some international criticism for having re-education through labor camps, China claimed they closed all of them. But unfortunately, Human Rights Watch did a great investigation, which found that pretty much most of the re-education through labor camps have reopened as drug detox centers. They're still, when I went to visit former re-education through labor camps, that was what I saw as well. There's still barbed wires, there's still guards. It looked very much like a prison camp, but it just had the name Drug Detox Center on the building instead. But no, very much detainees are still detained there doing forced labor, and they even for those who are drug addicts, they don't receive any kind of mental health help or any kind of wellness help to help them get better. It is still very much a forced labor facility.
From Nikki McQuiston, we have read through the years, or at least I've seen through the years, there are major brands that I mentioned a little while ago that have come out against this issue and have questioned China's practices regarding cheap and or forced labor. And so she asks about the company H&M, that's a men's and women's clothing store. One could say more towards the fast fashion spectrum of things. But what have been the results of when companies do that?
Yes, H&M is a great company to bring up for this discussion, not because they're great, but because they are absolutely a culprit in this. Actually, there's a British prisoner, former prisoner named Peter Humphrey, who was imprisoned in a prison camp himself. And while he was there, he saw H&M products being manufactured there. He saw the H&M label and actually wrote a great op-ed about his experience in the Financial Times after he got out. So he was in prison in Qingpu prison in Shanghai, and I tried to visit that prison, and I saw that there was actually an H&M factory within a 10-minute drive from that prison. Although it's hard to say if H&M, if there was actually that factory outsourcing work to a prison camp, but it just comes to show a lot of times these prison camps are everywhere, and it is very, very easy for them to subcontract work to each other if nobody is checking out who the subcontractors are.
Let's transition and begin talking about international response, US government response. Just last week, the Washington Post editorial board called on Western companies to boycott the 2022 Olympics in Beijing over the treatment of Uyghurs, the rollback of freedoms in Hong Kong, the religious persecution of Christians, Tibetan Buddhists, Falun Gong practitioners, and its overall record of human rights abuses. There's also a rising chorus calling on the US and other countries to boycott the games entirely. So how effective do you think these boycotts could be? And are these calls likely to gain traction through time as we become more and more polarized as a country? There's more and more boycotts being called for. And really, how effective are these boycotts if they're not widespread enough? Are they really creating an impact at that corporate company? But what are your thoughts on this?
I think boycotts hold the potential to be very effective. The boycott against Nike in the 90s actually led to pretty dramatic changes in the fashion industry and beyond. That's when they began doing audits in the first place. They didn't even do audits at all before, or let alone release that information to the public. So boycotts can be very effective. There's historical precedents for it. But unfortunately, at the scale that they're happening right now, I don't think it will be very effective. I don't think there's really, you're not seeing enough companies pull out of advertisements for the Beijing Olympics. So it doesn't seem to have a huge financial hit for Beijing at the moment. But as for other international responses, you are seeing it stepping up slowly. The US, the UK, the European Union, and Canada all recently announced sanctions against Chinese officials who are involved in human rights abuses against the Uyghurs. So that was really one of the first coordinated Western efforts you saw to hold China accountable for these camps. The Biden administration played a role in that, and hopefully we'll see them continue to keep up that pace.
Well, speaking of financial impact and dollar amounts, we have a question from one of our board members, Peter Lowe. He asks, do we have estimates of the dollar value on the goods being produced as a result of these labor camps?
It is hard. It's really hard to say. I'm really reluctant to give you an estimate because it's, again, we're not getting any kind of reliable data on this. We're kind of just basing this off of groups and journalists that have made estimates over the years. But early on, the Chinese government has actually released some estimates that it's quite a significant portion of the exports. It's just it's just very hard to untangle the part that was manufactured in a camp versus the part that was manufactured in a legitimate factory. How much of it do you count as forced labor?
You write that one particularly powerful catalyst to the proliferation of laogai camps was the US decision to establish formal diplomatic relations with the Chinese Communist Party. We have a new administration in place, and they have already begun high-level talks with the Chinese government. So how would you advise President Biden to address human rights? And are the most effective policies likely to involve financial pushback, as you have written? And we do have several people who are asking questions about what our government can do, how we can mitigate and address this topic.
I would strongly encourage the Biden administration to get the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act passed. What that act would do is it would ban all goods from the Xinjiang region, because the level of forced labor in that region is so high, you cannot verify something wasn't manufactured by forced laborers, that if it came from that region. That bill is currently sitting in the House and the Senate. It previously passed unanimously, I believe, in the House last year and in the last administration, but it just got stalled due to corporate lobbying efforts to get that legislation watered down or removed entirely. So they just reintroduced the bill recently, and we'll see what happens there. But that's one legislation that could be really effective, because Xinjiang is just a region with such economic importance to China. If a huge trading partner like the US were to ban all goods from Xinjiang, it would really it would be a big blow to China financially. And to the point where it would be hard for them to come back from. So that would be huge leverage for us in terms of pushing China to address the human rights issue in these camps.
Speaking of the international response, we have one of our staff members, Kirsten, ask about wanting to know comparative conditions in other countries like Vietnam. And do you feel that our country will ever shift away from China in favor of other rising economic powers in the region?
I I think so. I mean, already you're seeing some companies pull out of China because China is no longer the cheapest place to get goods. There's a lot of African countries that are they're developing economies, offer even cheaper labor. Um, you're seeing a lot of companies build factories in Myanmar now, and even Mexico. It's really um, globalization 2.0, as some would call it. Um, just the move out of China. China, in fact, is even facilitating that. They're trying to focus on high-tech manufacturing at the moment, and in the future be known less for the cheap stuff and more for the high-tech things like AI-enabled technologies. A lot of the medical devices they want to do, like those types of manufacturing work, but those could also be partially manufactured in a labor camp. It doesn't really solve the issue to move just one industry, like the fashion industry, for example, out of China.
Mm. Yeah, it's very true. It's a good point. Let's talk about the corporate response. In the book, you note a 2014 study which found that companies on the S&P 500 index with a sustainability mission outperform businesses without one. So can you talk a little bit more about that, and to what extent are matters of human rights part of sustainability missions today for companies, and versus, say, simply treating labor standard as part of compliance?
Right, that's a great question. Unfortunately, the word sustainability is often a marketing buzzwords for a lot of these companies. They make companies a lot of money. There's a lot of consumers that are willing to pay higher prices for a label that seems to suggest this product was ethically produced, or produced with environmental sustainability in mind. Um, but rarely do any of these companies actually have any kind of policies in place that could detect the forced labor issue. You're not seeing a whole lot of companies agreeing to pull out of Xinjiang, even though they may claim to be sustainable, because Xinjiang is one region that manufactures a lot of different types of goods, everything from cotton to tomatoes to um, just human hair extensions, and the raw materials of solar panels. Um, the US government did make a region-wide ban of tomato and cotton products from Xinjiang, but those are by far not the only products that are made there, and you really need to, I think the solution will have to be some kind of a coordinated government efforts across multiple governments to address the forced labor issue. We cannot really rely on companies to update their sustainability pages and start to take this issue seriously.
So we don't have too much time left, and I want to end on something that I feel is most important in this specific picture, and that is, what can we do as consumers to be more aware of the issues? How do we not partake in this? And do you think we're willing to pay more or change our spending habits in order to reduce the pulse for cheap goods? So what are your thoughts on that? What can we do? How can we help fix this?
I think the next time you go shopping online at your favorite brand's website, just be aware that you are their target market, and what you find important, the brands will pay attention to. So just take a moment and look at their sustainability page and see what it says, or see how little it reveals a lot of the times. My book, Made in China, is about educating consumers what what those sustainability pages should be saying, and what are red flags when they're not saying those things. And one of the things that sustainability pages should start all saying is that they're willing to pull out of Xinjiang. They're not sourcing any goods from Xinjiang because that is a region with a high level of forced labor. So if there's no mention of Xinjiang on that page, or a corporate social responsibility page, then that's a red flag. And another thing that we should start asking our companies to reveal to look for in their audits and to reveal on their pages is just how fast the product was made. Did the factory realistically have enough time to make the product in-house at a sustainable factory, or was the company just really trying to maximize on as much as they can off of the latest trends? We really need to start knowing that kind of information. We need to know how much the company actually offered their factories to make the products. Was that price realistically high enough to pay the wages of the local workers in the region, or did the Chinese supplier kind of have no choice but to outsource work to really shady places like labor camps where detainees do manufacturing work without payment? These are really the kind of details that we need to start asking our companies to reveal. And until those details are revealed, we cannot guarantee any of these products are not made by forced labor.
I have a feeling that there is not going to be a lot of information on a lot of these websites as we start to look into this. Well, I'm a big believer that it's not all or nothing. I think that to the extent that all of us can make an effort in this area, every bit helps. And hopefully slowly through time that will gain momentum and really create impact and change on this critical issue. Amelia, I can't tell you how appreciative we are that you are joining us. And obviously you heard so many questions from our audience. This is a topic of concern and interest for so many of us, and we are just thrilled to have you here. So thank you for joining us. Thanks for your flexibility. I'm sorry you had to get stuck with me, but we really appreciate your time.
You did a great job. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you so much to the World Affairs Council, and thank you so much to Terabang Books for supporting my work. I really encourage everyone to buy something from a Terabang Books, even if it's not my book. Books are such an important part of our community right now. Thanks again, everyone. You've been a great audience.
Absolutely. Well, Liz, Amelia, thank you for a fascinating discussion. It's absolutely an important issue, and I know that I have learned things that will make me a more conscious consumer moving forward, so thank you for that. Once again, like Amelia mentioned, you can pick up a copy of her book, Made in China, A Prisoner, an SOS Letter, and the Hidden Cost of America's Cheap Goods at interabangbooks.com. Remember to use the code dfwworld for 10% off your online purchase. Of course, you can catch up on all of our past virtual programs on the Council's YouTube channel, DFW World. And if you're not a member of the Council yet, please join us. We would love to see you more. And I know that Liz and the entire Council staff look forward to connecting with you in person when it is safe to do so. Visit dfwworld.org for more information on our membership options. Once again, thank you all for joining us. Have a great night.